Hello, this is another episode of how you can be active while staying at home. You know, it appears that most Americans are acquiescing to all the controls that they have been placed under due to the pandemic and how the government has reacted to it from state to state and federally. You know, sometimes you wonder if anybody's paying attention to what is really going on. Once in a while, we see things like this that appeared in the New York Times on the very front page a couple of days ago that said, "Pandemic tempts leaders to seize sweeping powers." Well, that's true. They've taken onto themselves powers that you wouldn't normally think that they would have. Here's another one out of the Wall Street Journal. It says, "Government tracking how people move around in a coronavirus pandemic." In other words, they're using that your personal tracking device, your cell phone, to find out where you're at all the time. Now, doesn't that sort of bother you that they would have that sort of a power to do that? And they're talking, by the way, not just doing it during the pandemic controls, but later. You know, a lot of these things that they're doing are not going to go away unless we force them to go away. And thinking about how to force people to go away, think about 1775 on the streets of Boston. Boston was full of British troops, watching what everybody was doing. They were even billeted in homes and that sort of thing. And I would imagine there was the occasion Bostonian who said, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, what's the problem? And that's the kind of attitude that we see with people today. If you're not doing anything wrong, if you're doing what you're told, what's the problem? They're not going to bother you. Can you imagine people today having the kinds of patriots that we had back in 75, 76 when we first started the revolution? Think back in your childhood. What did you study in school? Did you study about Patrick Henry? I know I did. His words were burned into my heart as a student when he said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Can you imagine a congressman standing up in Congress today saying that same thing? You'd hear shouts of extremists from wall to wall. Hey, Pat, let's not go that far. You know, we've got to get along with everybody, and that bill's coming up that we've got to get support for, so kind of cool it. Well, they didn't say that to Patrick Henry because Patrick Henry was saying what a lot of people thought. Give me liberty or give me death. Today, there aren't very many people out there willing to express it, let alone really believe it. And we only see, for instance, one congressman who actually stood up in this pandemic bill, a relief bill that came up, and said, hey, you're not doing the right thing here. You're doing it wrong. Whether you vote yes or no, you've got to be recorded, and it's got to be a certain number of votes in order to make this thing legal under the Constitution. And everybody shouted him down, an extremist, over a simple thing like that. Another thing that happened when our country was first put together was that they formed a Bill of Rights. Why did they do that? The first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States, because the people did not trust the government. Now, they'd been working with these people all the way through the Revolutionary War of 8 years, shoulder to shoulder, stood side by side in putting together the Constitution and everything else, but they still wanted a Bill of Rights. Why? They didn't trust even their friends. They couldn't even trust themselves. I know I've been on my small city council for a short period of time. I found I couldn't even trust myself. Why? Because people were always approaching me to vote yes, 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 more controls, more taxes, et cetera, but the average citizen didn't want it. But none of them walked into my office and said, vote no. And that's why it's so important that we have things that control the scope and breadth of government. The Bill of Rights has been one of the things that's helped the Constitution to be preserved over 200 years. It's the oldest constitution in use in the world, and the Bill of Rights is one of the reasons why it's lasted so long. It's a check and a balance on the power of government. Why do I bring this up? Because the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights says this: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or, and listen to this clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Now, you know something, it's very interesting that people haven't paid attention to. They say freedom of speech and the press. Those were the only two forms of communication when the Bill of Rights was formulated. Every other form of communication has come under federal control and regulation. First, there was the telegraph, then the radio, then the phone, then the radio, then television, and now cell phones and that sort of thing. All of these things came under the purview of the federal government because they weren't in the Bill of Rights. But the whole idea of freedom of the press and the freedom of speech was that government can't control communication. And all forms of communication subsequent to the writing of the Bill of Rights that have been invented have come under the control of the federal government because the people didn't get the spirit of it. And that's what we have to convey to people is the spirit of the Bill of Rights. What do these things mean to us today? And why did our founders put them down on paper and place them into the Constitution? The First Amendment is the pillar. You can't have the Second Amendment if you don't have the First Amendment or any of the other subsequent amendments either. We need to educate our fellow citizens on the Bill of Rights, what they really mean, and get them to appreciate it. And a lot of these things, sometimes we have to explain them a little bit better than just simply reading them because people aren't thinking the way they used to. So what we're asking you to do and what we're embedding in this video is the ability for you to study the Bill of Rights yourself, for your children, for your family, for your friends, your neighbors, and everyone else, and call them up or do whatever other means of communication to get them to watch these videos to appreciate the Bill of Rights and how that's being abrogated today, how it's being eroded. We need to educate and get people to appreciate the Bill of Rights. So while you're home, you've got the time, you can get your friends and neighbors to appreciate the Bill of Rights and understand what's really going on. You know, it says in the First Amendment, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof when they're talking about religion. And yet you're not allowed to go to church on Sunday. You will be even arrested in some cases. The mayor of New York, de Blasio, says, for instance, if you hold a meeting in your church, we'll not only come and make sure you don't do it again, we may close your church or synagogue permanently after this pandemic is gone. What kind of a person thinks like that? And how do they get that kind of power to be able to say that and perhaps even implement it? The things that are going on in the name of this pandemic are very dangerous. We've got to understand why they're dangerous and how to stop it. And the best place to start is with the Bill of Rights. Please study it. Please get everyone else to study it as well. Thank you.